para empezar a tratar de retomar lo que ya se dijo y ver qué piensan ustedes.
La idea es, aquí a los participantes, pedirles que estén abiertos a cualquier pregunta.
A lot of information, and I'm sure everybody has a lot of questions and ideas that they have. And what we want to do now is have an opportunity for open dialogue. And my role is to keep the conversation going. So my hope is that as some of the presenters before, you get a chance now to maybe ask some questions that you might not have asked earlier in the day, because there's so much more information that we now have. And I know that as I look at the colleagues, all of them have presented except one. Florian, a great architect, will be presenting a workshop right after this session, and you'll have a chance to interact with him. And then I know that after all of this, there's a reception on the patio, and I must say that it is a very beautiful city, and what an incredible view. It really inspired me when I went on the patio to think about how this city could be 20 years, 30 years, 50 years from now. And I thought about the fact that this could be the model city, not just for Mexico, but this could be the model city for the world in terms of social housing and the community. And I think it starts today, on this moment, to say that we all have a collective dream about making this city the best city in the world for what we want to achieve. And in the dialogue, I know that all of us have things that we've presented, but I wanted to just start by thinking about one theme that came out today, and I want to think about the theme of the fact that a house is really not the problem that we're talking about, that really it's everything else but the house. It's the environment, it's the community, it's the social structure of the family. Michael Peters talked about relationships between people. I know that Diane did a wonderful job this morning of saying that it's all these other structures that keep people from having the quality of life and the quality of housing. We had our friend Frank come up with a model that's affordable. When I looked at his house, the first thing that hit me was the house isn't the problem. It's everything else that we're trying to solve. This is more of a conference on urbanism. This is more of a conference on community. This is a conference on building the best city for the future, and the house is part of it, but it isn't the whole thing. I want to just start by asking for questions or comments, or let's just start a dialogue about what would success really look like. I'm going to have the president of the Mr. President of the cluster say some things first to kick us off.
Bueno, yo en el intermedio platiqué un poco con la doctora Diane Davis y hay dos puntos que me gustaría mucho que ampliara porque se me hacen muy importantes. Estoy totalmente de acuerdo contigo, el problema no es la casa. Yo creo que empezamos por un problema incluso de concepto. Y Diane decía una cosa muy interesante, son más importantes los proyectos que las normas, las leyes y la planeación. Yo creo que tenemos que pensar un poco en los proyectos y tenemos que pensar un poco en la ciudad. Entonces, ¿cuál es su idea de cómo se puede concretar esta idea de que son más importantes los proyectos para llevarlos a cabo en una ciudad como León, tomando como base el punto donde ella dice que hay que agregar valor urbano y hay que agregarle valor a la ciudad? Desgraciadamente vemos conjuntos habitacionales que no solo no le agregan valor a la ciudad, la agreden de una forma verdaderamente brutal, ¿no? Y nosotros como habitantes lo estamos permitiendo entre autoridades y y sociedad. Yo quisiera que se revalorara este sentido de que tenemos que regresarnos al concepto y pensar en otra escala y que nos hablara un poco más allá de cuál es la idea esta de que los proyectos son lo importante. Y antes de que me acabe el tiempo, quería mencionar la segunda, que es muy breve. Tenía otra frase que me llamó mucho la atención, que es más importante la calidad que la cantidad. Y no lo ponía en esos términos, sino que daba más beneficios la calidad que la cantidad. Yo creo que es una ecuación difícil de establecer cuando partimos de que la calidad significa costo y hablamos de los beneficios que eso tiene. Obviamente soy totalmente partidario de la calidad, no más que me gustaría que se ampliara este tema para ver cuáles son las fórmulas donde esto produce una mayor ganancia, haciéndola compatible con los intereses financieros de los desarrolladores.
Diane, did you catch all that?
Yeah, I think I caught most of it.
It was nice to hear that some of my main points in my presentation stuck in the audience. So one is about the house, not looking at the house, but looking at the city. The second, of course, is the project versus the plan, quality versus quantity. I'm going to take the opportunity to say a little more about the idea of the project and maybe say how I came to that. I might have mentioned it earlier in my presentation, but as many of you, well, you maybe don't know, I'm trained as a sociologist. I moved to a planning program at MIT. I was in a more engineering and institutional planning program. Then I moved to Harvard, which is the Temple of Design. We have amazing designers at the GSD, and I was introduced to a new world, a new way of thinking about cities. And when you start thinking through the lens, when you use design thinking, you want to come down to the objects. You don't necessarily want to just talk about the principles of design. You want to actually see and visualize what are the changes that you want in a city. And that made me start thinking a little bit more about the value of focusing attention on projects as opposed to norms and regulations and plans. Not that norms and regulations aren't important and they need to be there, but where we can really be creative is in thinking about the projects that might be embellished, that might embellish the objectives that are written in the laws and the plans and the norms. I'll say one more thing then about the project, and I'll throw it out to the audience or to my colleagues here. Maybe we could be experimental now and think about a project not only in terms of a housing project or a multifamily or a commercial development that has employment and commerce and housing. So we can think about a tangible form of a project, but we also should be thinking about the project for the city. Use the word dreams, we can talk about visions, but what should be the project, the kind of social spatial project for Leon, towards which any individual project might contribute? And I don't know the answer to that because I don't know enough about the history, the culture, the contemporary conditions in Leon, but you all have an opportunity to talk among yourselves about what should be the identity and the project of the city down the road, because once you start thinking about where you want to land in 10, 20, 30 years, then you can work backwards with what projects in which places, physical places of the city, will help you get there best.
Yes, what vision leads you to this future? And I like the idea of quality. I'm going to try my best at explaining what I think the quality and quantity argument comes down to, if I can. The quality of a house provides an ownership and a connection to that house, potentially for generations, requiring less housing to be built that's abandoned, and a supply and demand that allows there to be a better value for that house for society and for people. If that quality house can be closer to services, it becomes even more of a valuable commodity that people aren't abandoning because some of the housing is abandoned because it just doesn't work for their life. So I feel that finding that balance between quality location quality community, quality of life, and quality of housing will be a long-term investment, an investment that developers and that the government and that other players should be wanting to make. I also want to say one thing about this iconic vision that's so important. Diane and I did not know this before today, but we're both from St. Louis, Missouri. And I sense we're both from the same generation. She might be my long-lost sister from St. Louis. And I don't know if you know anything about St. Louis, but you might know that there's the Gateway Arch, the largest monument in the world. And it was in the 1960s, when I was little, that they had this vision of having something that the whole world could recognize from St. Louis. And I felt that if you had a vision of examples of social housing that work better than anywhere, you couldn't pick a better vision. And I just want you to think about that I think that Diana's made an incredible point to say, let's look 30 years from now and look out and say, what are the things that are going to make the world look at this community and say, wow, this community really did it right. I think that's very important. I want to have Florian speak. He hasn't spoken yet, and I want to get his thoughts on this kind of vision that you have.
Let's see, my fingers are more itching to start designing. I think there's a lot of conversation that has already happened, and I think now it's ready to start testing things. I like the idea that moving to the project, and as soon as you call something an experiment, it cannot fail. And it means we can try anything, right? We don't have to produce something, we don't have to produce a model that confirms certain preconceived notions, but we can, if we call it an experiment, we can build it and we can see what happens. And rather than calling it vertical housing, I think the idea of vertical living, what does it mean to live vertically? What does it mean to live? And I think if we are imagining this sort of Leon dream, you know, can we imagine what does it mean to live vertically, rather than just to house or accommodate housing vertically? During lunch, we snuck away to see some of the projects all the way at the perimeter on the west of the city. And there, the question rises, why are we repeating the same units over and over and over again? The kitchen, if it's too small, is you know, washing facility that every house needs to have. Why don't we wash collectively, or why don't we? So I do agree that we need to question, or that I think that the house as the unit is maybe not the problem, if what you're saying, or the location matters, but I would question, maybe we should start with the room rather than the house, right? How do we live? We sleep, we eat, we wash, we are together. Where does the private and where does the collective start? And I think if we start rethinking the unit and then rethink how that can aggregate in a vertical way, I think we might be able to start thinking about a new model.
And he is one of our professors at Harvard, very well respected, world respected architect. I can't wait to see his drawings. He has some very fascinating drawings that we've seen at Harvard that I can't wait to see. So I'm going to go back to a comment or question from the audience. Somebody have something? Yes.
What do you think about Alejandro Aravena? Do you think he's mejor en español? ¿Qué opinan respecto a Alejandro Aravena? Creo es maestro ahí en Harvard, se iba a quedar aproximadamente unos 4 o 5 meses, se quedó 5 años, ganador del premio Fisker. ¿Cuál es su opinión al respecto de Alejandro, respecto a los temas de vivienda social de Alejandro Aravena? Creo que lo deben de haber conocido por allá.
I'll say a little something then Florian and Drew too. I just came back from Venice, the Biennale. We had many of the GSD faculty were in the Biennale, so I've been thinking a lot about Alejandro because there's his work and then there's the vision he's laying out, and I think his work is a little more experimental than some of the visions that he's trying to, or some of the people that are trying to piggyback on Elemental the idea of incremental housing. That he took a very craftsman-oriented approach to social housing to be able to build housing that fits in the stages of people's lives and how they develop. So this is another way we're thinking about time. We've already just laid on the table that we're thinking about time over like decades, Leon now and 30 years from now, but you also have to think about the temporality of housing for family users and how housing can be flexible to respond to changes in family structures. And I think Alejandro is known for many things, but that is one of the elements that he as a Latin Americanist has introduced onto the scene. And I think it's a very important point. It raises the question, and we were also talking at lunch about this, as to whether some of so how do we think about not just living in verticality, but the temporality of verticality? Sorry to sound so jargonistic, but how do we think about building with a vision for vertical living that can accommodate change and flexibility in the units itself? And I think that will maybe be something you can do in the exercise. I mean, that's something experimental. Some of our students have tried to work about building structures that have open spaces where modules can get pushed in. It's also about property rights or shared spaces, etc. But I do think that we can take the idea of incremental housing and living and think about it more seriously in a place like Leon. I want to say one more thing, just as you can see, I like to do parallels, but I think it was interesting, Florian's response about designing the room. And I was talking about thinking about the structure of the entire city, and this is, the architect and I were talking at lunch, the importance of understanding that design thinking happens at multiple scales. And not everybody in this room will be thinking at all those scales together, but you have to be talking to each other. The person who's talking about the room and that scale, and the person who's talking about the region or the metropolitan area have to understand, make sure that those kind of visions are somehow talking to each other. So I do think, apropos your economic design thinking, that we have to be very careful about making sure that we are applying design thinking at all the scales that it needs to be applied to at the level of the city.
It's a very good point. Florian, do you have a comment you'd like to make on that?
I think Diane and I are from the same school, so I fully agree with everything she said. I'm not sure if I should add at this moment. We will come by in the preparation for the workshop. So this idea of expanding upon the unit will be something that we'll speak about a little bit later. So,
Okay, good. So we're going to have an experiment that we're going to work on together in our groups in just a little bit of time. I want to come back here to make sure folks in the back of the room who have a comment or question or want to make a point or ask a question of somebody get a chance to. I know you're kind of forgotten back here. Yes, right here.
Buenas tardes. En el tema de redensificación de ciudades, en la ciudad de León, Guanajuato, se tiene esas construcciones de un nivel, dos niveles en casi toda la zona centro, debido a que se ha pensado en la protección de edificios catalogados por el Instituto Nacional de Antropología e Historia, y algunos de esos edificios no se pueden tocar tan fácil. El problema está en que están mezclados con construcciones que se están cayendo, con construcciones que quedó la fachada, atrás ya no hay nada, que se utilizaron de estacionamiento, y que el reglamento que se hizo hace ya más de una década, quizá 2 décadas, no permitía que se construyera más arriba de lo que era la construcción de los lados o del frente, cruzando la calle. Quizá fuera conveniente hacer una modificación en ese tipo de reglamentos con el fin de ocupar todos esos lotes que están desocupados, y eso ya sería cuestión cuestión de verlo con el Instituto Municipal de Planeación y la Dirección de Desarrollo Urbano Municipal, y para hacer esos cambios y tratar de redensificar toda esa zona que fue convirtiéndose de ser vivienda, a mediados del siglo pasado todavía había mucha vivienda, a locales comerciales ya en este siglo. El problema está en que hay mucha inseguridad porque ya la gente ya no ocupa las calles en la noche, sobre todo en la noche, y redensificando toda esa zona ya pudiéramos traer más gente, más comercios de alimentos, de todo lo que requiera normalmente la población. Gracias.
Yes, Lauren? Yeah, I would say you can't have a future without having a history. So I think it's very important to think about what to do with the historic artifacts in the city. And I think, to create a rich urban culture, it's very important that different eras, throughout history are represented in the fabric. I don't know if in Leon it's full blocks or a whole area that is designated as a historic zone, or if it's individual buildings.
Hay zonas grandes,
Yeah.
barrios antiguos, quizá barrios probablemente que tengan más de 100 años, 200 años, de cuando se fundó la ciudad, pero son zonas que en aquel entonces, hace 20 años, se conocían como zonas A, B y C, y en esas zonas se aplica o se aplicaba incluso hasta la manera, los tonos de la pintura para las fachadas. Había una gama de colores autorizada para esa zona. Yo supongo que todavía sigue igual, pero la zona es grande, sí es grande esa zona.
Yeah. I mean, you do see, though, over the world that mostly, over time, historic districts are actually the areas with the strongest economical power and value. The other thing, though, I don't know if this is all in the center and if it is one sort of continuous area, because Diane was also speaking about, densification doesn't necessarily mean that densification happens in the center itself. You could also imagine a ring, right around the historic center. I come from Amsterdam myself, and we cannot build anything, above the canal houses. But then the densification happens right around the historic center, and something that actually changes the dynamic and the organization of the city. The downtown becomes an attractive pedestrian area, but there is enough capacity around there to have people actually be there. So maybe it's about the outline of the historic district.
I thank you for that question. I think it's a really important question. I want to make 2 points. Well, one, that gets back to my idea of the platform. But so the fact that you're trying to do redevelopment in an area that's designated historic preservation, either INA or INVA, puts restrictions on what you can and cannot do there. For me, that's an argument for the platform, because you have to be able to bring to the table, not just the developers in the city, but you have to bring the agencies and the actors who have control over those regulations and who may be willing to negotiate that. Now, I know I hate to bring up the concept of negotiation here where you do have a rule of law, you have laws, but as we all know in this room, that there's a lot of negotiation in and around the laws if you can get enough people to agree that it's good for the collective good. And I say that because I've done a lot of work on redevelopment in the historic center in Mexico City. I've written a lot about that. I wrote an article about the problems of INA stopping the redevelopment of the historic center in Mexico City. They struggled over that. They made new institutions. Carlos Slim invested millions of dollars. But over the years, that has been, I would say, a very successful effort to both modernize and keep the traditional center without gentrification. And I think we are all here concerned about social housing, and you want to be able to build for a variety of social groups. To look at the Mexico City case is a very interesting example, because there are ways, in a sense, that the restrictions of the historic agencies allowed more modest redevelopment rather than too upscale development, and it ended up being good for the city as a whole, but you had to be able to bring those people to the table and to negotiate which parts were going to be modified and which were going to be preserved.
Other questions, comments? Yes, right here.
Gracias, buenas tardes. Me da gusto escuchar que el siguiente participante es de Ámsterdam. Las ciudades europeas, creo que todos concordamos que son ciudades compactas, casi todas, densas, en un aspecto fundamental que tiene que ver con el tema de la movilidad, ¿no? Y Ámsterdam en particular tiene una característica que todos conocemos. Sin embargo, las ciudades americanas no son precisamente densas, son más bien ciudades muy extensas, en donde el tema de la movilidad es un tema crítico. Y bueno, la movilidad, aunque no se toca en esta mesa o no se ha tocado, es un tema fundamental para las ciudades densas, compactas, en economías de escala, etc. ¿Qué ciudades en Estados Unidos, si lo pregunto, tienen proyectos exitosos en tema de vivienda? Porque nuestra colindancia territorial con los Estados Unidos, bueno, nos hace que muchos de los modelos que luego se quieren ir a conocer y a ver, pues sea en esta situación, ¿no? Aunque tenemos internet, pues Europa es un poco más complicado. Me gustaría saber proyectos exitosos en los Estados Unidos.
I can start with that. We were looking outside today, and we were saying that it is so sad that most of Mexico, Latin America, has followed an American model since World War II. And the large growth of your country and other countries have been since the automobile. I come from a city, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is very small. We only have 300,000 people in the city center of Pittsburgh. It's very highly dense. We do not have a highway that wraps around our city. So our city would look the opposite of Houston. We have only one downtown, and we have a compact, walkable city. Why is our city so different than the other cities in America? Why is Boston different? Why are some of the cities that we aspire to be highly dense? Well, two things drive that. I think it's important we understand both factors. The first factor is, when was it developed? And the cities like ours, Boston, Philadelphia, New York, they were developed largely before the automobile. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing's a little harder to understand. The second reason is that there is an interest in urban infill. There's an interest in density for a lot of social benefits. For example, to pay for transportation when the city is all spread out is not a good deal for municipalities. To pay for all of the sewer and water and infrastructure improvement is not a good deal. We've been fortunate in Pittsburgh that we don't have a lot of land to grow because we have mountains and hills all around us. As you can see out the door, you can only go so far here. So one of the new thinking that's really becoming very popular around the world is a smart cities movement, where people are talking about limiting the size of the metro area or limiting the size of the city. There's talk in Detroit, Michigan right now about cutting the size of the city down by about a half because it's too much city to keep up with. And I think that one thing you could do in a 30-year view is to create a metropolitan plan that kind of pulled out some zones where you want to have high quality, high density urban environments. And of course you want to keep your historic downtown intact. That's one of your most beautiful things you have. But I think that if you look at some of the cities that are starting to say, we're not going to allow development to go much further, Pittsburgh is seen now in America as one of the top economically vibrant cities because we're not so big. If you've ever been to the Dallas airport, anybody, how many of you have been through Dallas and your lives as the city of Pittsburgh where we live? Okay, our city is the same size as their airport. So if you want to look at a good model, look at our city. It's very small and very compact.
Can I have some quick things, and I know I actually don't want to say too much because I'm really excited to get to the design exercise with Florid, but you're talking about issues that I've been thinking about my whole life. So the first comment, I like your question very much. Let's get real. You know, we can impose a model of density, but if you're talking about post-war development, that's kind of, you can't create Europe in the middle of Leon because you have very different history, a built environmental history. But the first thing I would say is it's important to remember to distinguish between population density and building density. So Mexican cities, even though they're sprawled, are extremely dense with population. Lots of, especially poor people, lots of people living in very small spaces. Slower? Okay. So, the translator says I need a break. So there is a lot of density in Mexican cities, but it's not building density. So, and I think that's an important distinction because that also allows you to think about both acknowledging and adapting to the original population density and then making buildings that enhance that rather than building the American model that would reduce the numbers of people.
That's correct.
The second thing I wanted to say about examples in the United States, it's a really good question, and we don't have a lot of examples in the newer cities that I think that I would hold up as models for really dealing with the car culture. But the one set of insights that I would share with you is, first of all, maybe it's helpful to think about reducing sprawl as much as increasing density. And in order, when you start thinking in those terms, transportation becomes absolutely central to the problem of reducing sprawl and increasing and enhancing density. And that's what is also meant with the urban value creation platform. You need people at the table that are going to be talking about mobility for people to get back and forth from wherever they're living to work in order to make a more defensible urbanism happen or more a better quality of life. Transportation is really important, and I can say this because I'm working on another project on transportation in 7 cities around the world. Cities in Europe are very far ahead of American cities, but there are some cities, San Francisco as well as New York, are really investing more in transportation, and that enhances density. It has its downside sometimes because it increases property values, because everybody wants to be able to walk and live where they work, but that is an important element. So you have to have transport people talking to housing people. Now, the challenge you have in Mexico is not just the fragmentation of governance institutions, but in particular in Mexico, transportation, most transportation is privately provided by transport mafias. They're very hard to regulate, and they go across municipalities, but powers for decision are in the municipality. And there's not a lot of money to build mass transport, maybe BRTs, but you are reliant on peceros and microbuses, and that's a different political animal, urban animal, but they have to be involved in the conversation about housing, and that's what a cluster or a platform allows, at least to start that conversation.
Monica says that it's going to be time real soon to listen to Florian's presentation. Any last comments someone wants to make? Yes, hi. Your comment right here.
Hola, buenas tardes. Yo quisiera saber cómo comenzar a trabajar con la redensificación de las ciudades, con los costos sobrevaluados que hay de terrenos o de edificios deshabitados, que puedan estar en manos de inversionistas privados y que a final de cuentas no podamos cumplir con la labor social, que es a lo que vamos, ¿no?
guys. I want to just say that without the private sector being engaged in the cluster, without there being this multi-layered consortium, you really can't get very far. The idea that government can solve housing or transportation or really any issue is totally not going to happen. But on the other hand, the idea that without government, the private sector would do the right thing and that people would have the right vision is not the right thing either. The same with the nonprofit sector or the charitable foundation sector. I believe in my research for 30 years that the only great projects that ever happen when we're able to pull all of those folks together and to creatively come up with solutions. And all the great examples in the world have all of those players at the table. What I want to say kind of in conclusion of this session is that without the cluster being there to move this vision forward, there's really no chance of success. And I think that one real easy thing to do would be start an inventory of available places close to the center of the city where we can start modeling some examples. Sometimes in life, it's one or two examples that work that can get the rest of the market moving, that can create this energy that over time starts to build a whole new model. And we were talking at our panel discussion before, over lunch, on if there could be just one or two projects that we could all point to where the private sector was engaged as well. Some of these folks that have large amounts of land in the center city, if we could engage with them, have a couple of model projects, it could become a model for other states, it could become a model for other countries, and it really doesn't require more than a few successes. We don't have to have the entire problem of social housing fixed. We need to fix it a few times. And maybe that's a good intro to our colleagues who's going to show you some examples of housing from around the world where they actually have fixed some of the problems we talked about today. So I'm going to turn it over to Florian. We're going to keep going.